Well, it's really good to be with you all. Really a privilege to be on this campus and to be able to share this story. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but kind of by way of introduction to me, the role, my passion and interest in art is largely self-guided. I didn't study art in college. None of the degrees that I have are related to art. But for the last 10 or 15 years or so, I've written a lot about the stories and done a lot of research on art because I come from a small farming community in Indiana where my culture, the culture I was a part of, was a culture of storytellers, and farmers are storytellers. They remember things in a narrative kind of way. And for me, I always felt like there was a barrier to entry for many people when it comes to engaging with art, because they feel like, well, if I didn't understand my art appreciation class in college, maybe art is just not my thing. And art in its essence really is storytelling. And so I have had this interest in digging into the stories behind some of the works of art that have mattered to me. And that which always just one story always leads to another story and leads to another story. And so in a moment, what I'm going to do with the middle portion of our time is just tell you a story, if that's okay. And there's pictures. So it's a story with pictures. That's better. I had an art teacher in high school who the greatest gift that she gave us as students is she loved art in front of us. So she didn't just teach us about art. She didn't just have us make things, but we learned that she loved people like Vincent van Gogh and George O'Keeffe and Frank Lloyd Wright. And she told us as students, so I'm 15, maybe when I hear this for the first time, she said, if you want to have a lifelong relationship with the arts, find an artist that you connect with and then just pay attention to them for the rest of your life. And they will introduce you around. They'll introduce you to their friends and colleagues on the gallery walls next to them. You'll read the plaques and you'll learn who their mentors were. And then before you know it, they will have introduced you around to a community of people that will then further introduce you around. And so I kind of took that as the way that I engaged with art. And I've just been paying attention. My docents in that journey have been Vincent van Gogh and Rembrandt. And so these are the two that really kind of go back the furthest for me. And so what we're going to talk about today is the story behind one of the two most commonly known things about Vincent van Gogh. So if people know anything about Vincent van Gogh, I think the two things they know is that he painted Starry Night, and what's the other one? He cut off his ear, right? That's the story that's kind of ubiquitous with Van Gogh. And one of my, if I have an agenda for today, one of the agendas will be that anybody who's in this room will never laugh at that story again. Because it's a tragic story, but it's also a story that we don't really know, but it gets to, we wouldn't have the art without the suffering. We wouldn't have the voice of Vincent van Gogh without the pain of Vincent van Gogh. We'd have something different. And so I just so you can find me kind of on a philosophical and theological map. I am a Christian pastor, and I am part of my interest in telling these stories is understanding how art and the stories behind works of art that have been created that the world has resonated with intersect with historic Christian faith. And Van Gogh is a person whose life, one of the great gifts that we have from his life is we have an abundance of correspondences. We have over 800 letters that Vincent wrote that are preserved. There's a great website called vangoghletters.org, I think it's org, where all of his letters are there. They're they're in the original language, usually French, transcribed into English, and many of them are actually scanned in so you can see the physical letter, which usually has some drawings and sketches of paintings he was working on. So he's an artist, and he wrote all the time, like several letters a week. And so you would have often, and so you have this record of his life that is kind of up to the month of what he was working on and what he was thinking about. And so I don't know that there's an artist in history where we have that kind of depth of record for what was internally happening in them, which makes Van Gogh accessible in ways that are uncommon. And so, anyway, so I'm going to tell this story, and then when I'm done telling you the story, I'd love to have a time of just discussion, if you would be up for that. So, without further ado, once upon a time, Flannery O'Connor, she said, a story is a way of saying something that can't be said any other way. And I love that quote because I think that stories are Trojan horses for truth. They're ways to invite people to think about subjects and concepts without it driving toward the moral to the story, without it driving to a point, without it driving to an application, but instead to let the story kind of do its work on us over time. And this story for me is one of those that really continues to do some work inside of me. Can we? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll try to get a little bit closer. Okay, here we go. Oh, if I could have worked without this accursed disease, what things I might have done. Vincent van Gogh. In the late 1990s, a special Vincent van Gogh exhibit came through my city. I remember I was living in St. Louis at the time. There was a collection in this exhibit of a few Van Goghs and then a great many works by later painters that he had inspired, and they were arranged on these temporary walls that guided us through this narrative of his life. And so you do as you do in an art museum, you enter by the coat check, and you spend the next hour learning about Van Gogh's brilliance and his influence, and then you exit through the gift shop. And when we exited through the gift shop, there were posters and replications of the works that were there, a few of them, postcards, that sort of thing. But largely, to my surprise, the gift shop was largely just a collection of tchotchkes making light of Vincent's severed ear. And so you could get an enamel lapel pin or an eraser in the shape of an ear. You could get a thermal coffee mug that bore Vincent's portrait with a note beside it that explained, when you pour in a hot beverage, Vincent's ear magically vanishes before your very eyes. Easy Van come, easy Van go. And it broke my heart to see that, and it still does. Because for most of us, our greatest shame and our deepest hurts are closely guarded secrets that are known only to a few, if anyone. And we protect those parts of ourselves, all of us, not just because they're shameful, but really because they're sacred. What if the story behind Vincent cutting off his ear isn't really that funny? What happened there is undoubtedly one of the lowest points in an already tortured soul's life. And it helps us to see not just his shame, but really the hope that surrounds it, to look into this story. It shows us that in the end, we really are not our worst moments, and we are not our biggest failures. This story teaches us about the sacred work of stewarding another person's pain. What do you do when you know and you carry the knowledge of another person's shame or woundedness? It bids us be gentle, because this is a hard world. When the night train pulled into the Arles station at 5 a.m. on October 23rd, 1888, A man in a black suit stepped out onto the platform, and he let his eyes adjust, and he took a suitcase from the porter, and he studied the map on the wall by the ticket window. Okay, 1 block south, then a quick left to the square, 1 block over. The address that he was looking for was 2 Place Lamartine, and it was at the northeast corner of the square. The 2-story house was shuttered, and all was quiet in the square except for the faint din of activity coming from around the corner. Following the sound, the man saw lights spilling out onto the street from the Café de la Gare, known to the locals as the Café de Nuit, or the night cafe. Night cafes in France were these 24-hour establishments where night prowlers can take refuge when they have no money to pay for lodging or are too drunk to be taken in, one local said. The outer walls of the Café de Nuit were lined with marble-top tables, and in the back there was a simple, well-stocked bar, and in the center of the room a large green billiard table. A few customers sat slumped over their drinks, waiting for the day. The proprietor, who was a tidy man in a white suit named Joseph Michel Genoux, emerged from the back, and he took one look at his new arrival, and he said, "Ah, you must be Monsieur Gogh. Welcome." And the man looked at him curiously. Genoux said, "Your host showed me your picture, the one you sent. He said I might find you in need of refreshment. What can I get for you?" The sun wouldn't be up for another couple of hours, and so Gogh settled down at a table. At first light, he paid Genoux, and he thanked him, and then he went around the corner to find the house just as his host had described it, butter yellow, with green shutters, which were now open. Gogh knocked on the door, and he waited. The quick patter of footsteps came down the stairs like the sound of a man running. An excited but anxious Vincent van Gogh opened the door. Martin Gayford, a Vincent van Gogh scholar, said Gauguin's arrival was, it is safe to say, among the most exhilarating, but also the most anxious moments in Vincent's life. No sooner had he signed the lease for the Yellow House, almost 6 months before, than Vincent started to evolve his plan. He didn't want to live in the house alone. He desperately yearned for company. And right from the start, Gauguin had come to mind as the ideal companion. Gauguin's arrival was more than a visit from a friend. The two barely knew each other when he showed up. His presence, which took a lot of persistence and cajoling on Vincent's part, and which had been delayed several times for a variety of reasons, made Vincent wonder if Gauguin really wanted to come at all. But his presence there represented a crucial step toward Vincent's dream of an artist colony in the south of France. Neither Vincent van Gogh nor Paul Gauguin were considered successful artists at this point, but both of them, through a series of different but circumstances that were similar, they had committed themselves to this path, to this vocation, to being painters. After working as a missionary and an art dealer, Vincent tried his hand at painting at the age of 27. 27. He was immediately taken by the sensuality and the mystery of what the infinite combinations of color and composition could produce. His letters were just filled with enthusiasm and curiosity and reverence and zeal for the craft of painting, that it would be hard to imagine him doing anything else, loving anything more. As for Gauguin, the Yellow House was more of a strategic move for somebody who had limited options. In 1873, at the age of 25, Gauguin married a Danish woman from Copenhagen named Sophie Gad, with whom he had 5 children. Gauguin struggled professionally, and his professional struggles, combined with his desire to paint, fractured his marriage, and in 1885, Sophie urged Gauguin to just go ahead and move to Paris while she and the children stayed back in Copenhagen with her parents. Gauguin struggled to make his way back into the artistic community when he moved to Paris. He lived in poverty for that first year, producing only a few works. The The following year, he moved to an artist colony in Brittany on the Atlantic coast, and he found unexpected success and even admiration among the younger artists who gathered there in the summer. And coastal life really suited Gauguin. It was cheap, it ran at a slow pace, and so he resumed his painting and he took up fencing and boxing as well. We'll come back to that in a minute. But he became quite proficient as a boxer. In 1887, Gauguin moved across the Pacific to Panama and then to the Caribbean island of Martinique, a French colony. Interestingly, while Gauguin was living in Panama, they were constructing the Panama Canal, and he served on a work team building the Panama Canal. So Paul Gauguin was part of the group of people that dug the Panama Canal. So he went over there to this French colony, Martinique, and while he was there, he painted close to 20 paintings, and then he sent them back, and back in France, he showed them to a gallery, and in that gallery, they were seen by Vincent van Gogh and by his brother Theo. And Theo purchased 3 of Gauguin's paintings to display them in his art dealership, Goupil, bringing visibility not just to the paintings, but bringing visibility to the painter as well. And so Gauguin's relationship with Goupil was instrumental in his decision to join Vincent in Arles, because once Vincent was convinced that Gauguin would be the perfect partner for his brotherhood of painters in the South, he pleaded with Theo to make Gauguin an offer that he couldn't turn down: free board and lodging in exchange for pictures, as long as he agreed to live in the Yellow House. And so this gave Gauguin a place to live. It also guaranteed that Gauguin's work would be shown and offered for sale so that it could be purchased by art dealers and collectors. The only catch was that he had to live with Vincent. Gauguin and Vincent got to know each other through correspondence, which for Gauguin was a way for him to develop and refine his philosophy and his approach to art. But for Vincent, it was an opportunity to exchange letters with a painter that he really admired. In their relationship, Gauguin was the one trying to figure out how to earn a living as a painter. So his use for Vincent never really strayed far from the goal of figuring out how to earn a living as a painter. Vincent, however, was trying to figure out how to truly live as a painter. And though those may seem like the same thing, they run in parallel. He wasn't primarily interested in how Gauguin's influence might elevate his notoriety or success. He just wanted Gauguin's friendship and inspiration. And these differing goals for their friendship made for a potentially volatile chemistry long before Gauguin ever pulled into that station in Arles. It must have made Gauguin dodgy in his commitment, and it left Vincent anxious about his arrival, because Vincent's thinking, what if Gauguin hates Arles? What if he finds the pastoral countryside uninspiring? What if he felt like he had been deceived and came to resent Vincent as a result? Prior to Gauguin's arrival, he and Vincent exchanged pictures of themselves. Maybe you've seen these 2 paintings. These paintings had a purpose. And these paintings were how Janus was able to recognize Gauguin. What each man agreed to do was create a self-portrait, especially for this occasion, and they agreed to tie their portraits to literature in some way, to reveal a bit more of their personalities and their passions. And so Van Gogh scholar Martin Gayford said this. He said, these pictures were indices of how Gauguin and Van Gogh imagined themselves. Each had presented his image in character as a figure from literature. One thing they had in common, Gayford said, was an intense fantasy life in which their own real lives merged with their reading. Gauguin painted himself as Jean Valjean from Les Mis, presenting himself to Vincent as an outcast, as a martyr, as a hero, as the leader of a band of rebels, possibly a nod to the Impressionists being that band of rebels. And to Vincent, he wrote these words about his painting. He said, "It is the face of an outlaw, ill-clad and powerful, like Jean Valjean, with an inner nobility and gentleness. The face is flushed, the eyes accented by the surrounding color of a furnace fire. This is to represent the volcanic flames that animate the soul of the artist. The girlish background, with its childlike flowers, is there to attest to our artistic purity. As for this Jean Valjean, whom society has oppressed, cast out, is he not equally a symbol of the contemporary Impressionist painter? In endowing him with my features, I offer you as well an image of myself, a portrait of all the wretched victims of society." Vincent sent Gauguin a portrait of himself with close-cropped hair and subtly slanted eyes, giving himself the look of a Japanese monk. I believe this painting is at the Harvard Art Museum. I know this painting is at the Harvard Art Museum, just up the street. So he got this idea from Pierre Loti's novel Madame Chrysanthemum, later adopted into the opera Madame Butterfly, about French military officers stationed off of the coast of Japan, in which Buddhist monks play a small role. But to Gauguin, he wrote this about the painting. He said, "If we study Japanese art, we see a man who is undoubtedly wise, philosophic, and intelligent, who spends his time doing what? He studies a single blade of grass. But the blade of grass leads him to draw every plant, and then the seasons, the wide aspect of the countryside, then animals, then the human figure. Come now, isn't it almost a true religion, which these simple Japanese people teach us, who live in nature as though they themselves were flowers?" Perhaps Vincent chose the likeness of a monk to convey a posture of submission to his French veteran guest. Or maybe he was trying to say that he was, as a person, contemplative, that he was austere. Either way, neither man was truly like the image that they sent. Gauguin was not the hero of a band of rebels, and Vincent could be quite volatile and manic. When Gauguin knocked on the door of Vincent's yellow house, both men had ideas of what they hoped to get out of this artistic union, and both worried that they might disappoint the other and not hold up their end. And their portraits, I think, were attempts to prepare the other for who they hoped to be once they came together. But people are who they are. And though we might try to frame ourselves, any of us, in a certain light, drawing attention to our better qualities, once we let someone get close enough to us, they will eventually see the things that we leave out of the self-portrait as well, the things that we try to hide, those unflattering truths that have become so familiar that we no longer notice they're there, but come as a surprise to others. Vincent took great care and deliberation in decorating the yellow house. From the art on the wall, to the yellow linens and curtains, to the green paint on the shutters, to the furniture that he accumulated over time. He'd been renting part of it as a studio since May, but he had leased the remaining bedrooms in September. He said, "I have it all planned. I really do want to make it an artist's house, but not affected. On the contrary, nothing affected, but everything from the chairs to the pictures full of character." As Vincent showed Gauguin around, he pointed out the canvases that he had painted for the yellow house. Vincent's room featured 6 paintings, 4 landscapes of local gardens, and 2 pots of sunflowers. Other works decorated Vincent's bedroom and the hallways, but as they moved from room to room, Gauguin was surprised to find that there were paintings everywhere, in stacks on the floor. Vincent was, as one scholar said, engaged in one of the most astonishing creative sprints in Western art. During his 15 months in Arles, France, he produced around 200 canvases. Many of them, the masterworks we know: Starry Night over the River Rhone, the night cafe, the cafe terrace, vase with 15 sunflowers, the sewer, a pair of shoes, and the Red Vineyard. Incidentally, the Red Vineyard is the only painting that Vincent van Gogh sold during his lifetime. He sold one, and it was this one. Most of these paintings were just stacked in the yellow house when Gauguin arrived. The scene must have been simultaneously impressive and disconcerting. Evidence of creative insatiability and also a manic compulsion to produce at a pace and volume no one had ever seen. And it just continued, by the way. After he left the Yellow House, the last year and a half of his life, he produced another several hundred paintings. The last 3 months of his life, he averaged a completed painting a day for 90 days. 90 paintings in 90 days. It's impressive, and it'll break your heart if you start thinking about it too much. Vincent's downstairs studio, where he produced these works, was just a chaotic mess. Gauguin recalled, he said this, "I was shocked. His box of colors barely sufficed to contain all those squeezed tubes which were never closed up." All told, Gauguin spent 63 days with Vincent in Arles, and they were 2 of the most productive months of each artist's career, and they were also 2 of the most turbulent. Vincent treated Gauguin as his superior, even coming to resent Gauguin's tone of superiority, which came across to him as critical and magisterial. Vincent felt that Gauguin regarded him as a rival, deliberately trying to goad him into anger. He struggled, Vincent did, to control his temper, and then he would argue back with Gauguin with a stubbornness and a bite all his own. During their time together, Gauguin assumed control of their partnership. He planned their days, he cooked their meals, he managed their money, even down to how much they would pay the women at the brothels when they visited them. Vincent quickly came to depend on his guest as though Gauguin was now the host. One historian wrote this, Vincent's emotional attachment to Gauguin became so strong that whenever Gauguin threatened to leave, Vincent became agitated, fearful of isolation, even once hurling a glass of absinthe at his friend. Vincent and Gauguin were on many occasions heavy drinkers. When Vincent drank, his behavior became even more mercurial than when he was sober. One afternoon, Vincent and Gauguin were sitting silently in Genou's cafe, and they'd been arguing over art and politics, and they'd been at it for so long that eventually they just stopped talking. And then, without warning, Vincent hurled his glass of absinthe at Gauguin's head. Gauguin dodged the glass, and then he grabbed Vincent by the collar, and he dragged him out into the street, and now Gauguin, the boxer, was ready to go. But he couldn't bear to strike this glassy-eyed, pitiful associate in front of him. And so he went back into the cafe. And Vincent shuffled home, and he passed out until the next day. And he woke the following morning confused, claiming to have a vague memory of assaulting his friend, and then he begged for Gauguin's forgiveness. And Gauguin replied, saying this in a letter, he did not mind at all, and that he was accustomed to rougher treatment. If, however, one of those absinthe glasses should happen to hit him, he was not prepared to answer for the consequences. After that, Gauguin decided that it was time to part ways. He wrote to Theo to let him know, but Vincent pleaded with Gauguin to reconsider, and they seemed to reach some kind of an agreement. So Gauguin wrote in a second letter to Theo, withdrawing his decision to leave, but he did write to a friend, I am staying here for now, but I am poised to go at any moment. The week before Christmas, 1888, it rained nonstop. That left Vincent and Gauguin cooped up inside, and they just picked at each other. On December 23rd, Just a few days after the absinthe incident, Vincent and Gauguin went to the art museum in Montpellier. And as they moved through the galleries, their bickering resumed. And they argued about the works that they saw and the merits of the different painters on display. And the dispute carried over into dinner. And once Gauguin had finished his meal, he got up from the table and he left the yellow house to clear his head and to let things calm down. Vincent wasn't sure if if Gauguin had left for good. And so in a blur of panic, he went up into his bedroom and he picked up his straight razor, and then he followed Gauguin out into the dark streets. And as Gauguin was walking across the square toward the Rhone, he heard somebody running up behind him. And Gauguin described the confrontation like this. He said, "I heard behind me a well-known step, short, quick, irregular. And I turned about on the instant as Vincent rushed toward me, an open razor in hand. And my look at that moment must have had great power in it, for he stopped, lowering his head, and then he set off running toward the house." Gauguin decided that he would spend the night in a hotel rather than return to a roommate who had just threatened his life. Vincent ran up to his room and he stared into his mirror, cursing himself. And then he raised his blade and he slashed off a significant portion of his left ear, severing his auricular artery, causing blood to spurt all over the walls and the floor. And then he grabbed one of the yellow linens that he had bought especially for the yellow house, and he cut it into strips and attempted to staunch the bleeding. And after soaking those linens through, he washed his amputated ear carefully, and he wrapped it in an envelope made of newspaper. And then he pulled a hat down over his head and he crossed the same circle where he had his confrontation with Gauguin, and he went to the brothel that they would visit. And that week's Le Forum Républicain carried the story of what happened next. This is the article from the newspaper. "Last Sunday at 11:30 p.m., one Vincent van Gogh, painter of Dutch origin, presented himself at the Maison de Tolérance No. 1, asked for one Rachel, and gave her his ear, saying, 'Guard this object very carefully.' Then he disappeared." Rachel fainted when she opened the grisly package. The local postman, Vincent's friend Joseph Rouland, found Vincent at the brothel, half-conscious, delirious, still bleeding from this wound. The brothel was in an uproar. Word began to spread to all of the neighbors of Vincent's shocking appearance and presence. And so Rouland walked Vincent home and he put him in bed. In the early morning hours of Christmas Eve, Virginia Chabot, who ran the brothel, took the parcel that Vincent had given to Rachel and showed it to a police officer, who, upon confirming that it was indeed an ear, summoned his superior. The two officers went to the yellow house to look for Vincent, and they found the blood-soaked painter in his bed in a deep sleep. They called a doctor. Gauguin knew nothing of this incident. Not until the next morning, when he returned to the yellow house to find a crowd of neighbors and police officers gathered on the street out front. One bystander asked him what he had done to his roommate. Another told him that Vincent was dead. Gauguin went upstairs as calmly as he could, and he found a police officer and a doctor next to Vincent, who was still soaked in blood and sound asleep. And describing the scene, Gauguin later recalled this. He said, "In the bed lay Vincent, rolled up in the sheets, curled up in a ball. He seemed lifeless. Gently, very gently, I touched the body, the heat of which showed that he was still alive. For me, it was as if I had suddenly gotten back all my energy, all my spirit. And then in a low voice, I said to the police commissioner, 'Be kind enough, monsieur, to awaken this man with great care. And if he asks for me, tell him I have left for Paris.' the sight of me might prove fatal to him. Back in Paris, while all this was happening, as Vincent was slashing off his ear, his brother Theo was getting engaged. A Christmas engagement. He had just finished writing a letter to his fiancée telling her the good news when he got a telegram from Gogh telling him what had happened to his brother. And so when Gogh's message arrived, he left a short note for his fiancée, Joanna. And the note said this: Vincent is gravely ill. I don't know what's wrong, but I shall have to go there as my presence is required. I'm so sorry that you will be upset because of me, when instead I would just like to make you happy. Theo caught the 7:15 express train, and he headed south, and he arrived in Arles on Christmas morning. He found Vincent in the hospital. Gogh was still in town. Vincent had asked Theo over and over again if he could see Gogh, but Gogh stayed away from Vincent for fear of upsetting him further and likely to avoid any desperate pleas for him to stay. That night, Theo and Gogh returned to Paris together on the night train, and Vincent, after that, never saw Gogh again. That was the last. When Vincent regained some lucidity, the doctor asked him about the incidents of the 23rd. He claimed not to remember much. And when pressed as to why he severed his ear and gave it to Rachel, he said his reasons were, quote, quite personal. Certainly, in the agony of his own anxious mind, he blamed himself for driving Gogh away. And it wasn't just the end of a friendship, remember, that he so earnestly prized. It was the end of a dream for the Yellow House, this artist colony in the south of France. Gayford said, Vincent was responsible for the terrible solitary life that he led, isolated again now that Gogh had left, and Vincent punished himself. The day after Christmas, while still in the hospital, Vincent learned that Theo and Gogh had gone, and he experienced a violent breakdown and had to be restrained in a straitjacket and locked into a solitary padded room. Roulin took over the task, the postman took over the task of looking after Vincent, sending Theo regular updates. Vincent's condition was fragile. He remained weak and despondent. And after one particularly rough evening, Roulin wrote to Theo, he passed a very bad night, and they had to put him again in an isolated room. He has taken no food and completely refused to talk. That is the exact state of your brother at present. Within a few days, to everybody's surprise, Vincent experienced a kind of recovery. Though his doctor, Felix Ray, believed Vincent would always retain, quote, the extreme excitability that was the basis of his character, Vincent's mind kind of cleared for a moment. And he asked about Gogh and Theo, but not with the same desperation of the previous days, but with the concern of a man who knew that he had put them through an ordeal. A week later, on January 4th, Vincent's doctors allowed him to make a short visit to the Yellow House. He walked into his flat to find Gauguin's room bare, except for the furniture and the paintings that Vincent had supplied for his new friend. This time, Vincent didn't break down, but instead he sat down and wrote a letter, a conciliatory letter, to his friend Gogh, apologizing for his behavior. On January 7th, a few days after that, Dr. Ray felt that Vincent had stabilized and he discharged him from the hospital. And Vincent fared well enough at first, but not long after returning home in early March, he began acting erratically again. He became the object of his neighbors' ridicule and scorn, and now also their fear. Some avoided him as though he was a dangerous madman. Others sought him out in order to mock him and to throw things at him. One Van Gogh scholar wrote this: 81 venerable students of the town petitioned the mayor of Arles with a view to putting an end to the turmoil. They requested that the madman should be removed and taken to an institution specifically designed for such people, for which they paid taxes as citizens. In truth, it wasn't 81 people, but it was 30 people who signed the petition, but included was the signature of one Joseph Genoux, the proprietor of the Café de Newt, Vincent's former landlord, friend, and purveyor of absinthe. The mayor did his duty as a servant of the people, and he ordered that Vincent should be forcibly removed from the Yellow House and committed to the section for lunatics in the hospital, where he was once again put into that padded cell. The Yellow House was then sealed by local officials until Theo could come and gather his brother's property. Vincent, after that, never returned to the Yellow House. And for all of this, you can buy a coffee mug where when you pour in a hot beverage, Vincent's ear magically vanishes right before your eyes. Easy Van come, easy Van go. One of the most heartbreaking parts of Vincent's story, for me, is how he often struggled to remember his outbursts and his breakdowns. He couldn't remember them. Some part of his brain was in a fog, perhaps from his drinking, maybe from lead poisoning, from ingesting paint. He would hold his brushes in his mouth, working with lead-based oil paints. Any number of other reasons researchers have speculated on over the years. He wasn't always aware of what he was doing, and he couldn't always remember what he had done. He didn't remember much about the night when he cut off his ear, though it is almost certainly one of the most common things we associate with him today. Many, my point is, are more aware of his madness than his art. So be gentle. Be gentle, because this is a hard world. Speaking as a Christian, if the Lord in his kindness gives to us the blessing of friendship, then he is most certainly calling us to the holy work of burden bearing. To be a friend is to carry burdens. Stick around long enough in any relationship, and you will come to see more than the initial portraits offered. Gauguin presented himself as Jean Valjean, the aspirational vision of a man whose primary challenges came from the unjust world around him. And Vincent offered himself as a man who had mastered inner peace. Neither portrait was accurate. But then, what about ours? Are the portraits that we're inclined to lead with ever really the full truth? Do they ever really tell the full story? To love somebody is to be moved beyond first impressions into the heart of things. It is to take on the sacred work of stewarding another person's joys and sorrows. To really know a person is, in some ways, to know them by their sorrows. And this is a relational characteristic in the Bible. The way that the Bible talks about people, many of them we know by their suffering, and we know by their sorrow. So if you consider the ministry of Jesus and the people that he met along the way, let me just illustrate this. If you've spent much time in Scripture, if you're somebody who's read the Bible, when I mention some of these names, you'll know who I'm talking about. And all of them are described by their suffering. There's Matthew the tax collector. There's Simon the leper. There's blind Bartimaeus. There's doubting Thomas. There's Judas the betrayer. There's the man with the withered hand. There's the woman caught in adultery. There's the boy with the unclean spirit. There's Talitha, the girl who had only been asleep. There's the widow from Nain. There's the rich young ruler. There's the woman with the issue of blood. There's the paralytic from Capernaum, the demoniac who lived among the tombs, and the thief on the cross. We know them. And we know them by their failures. And we know them by their afflictions. And we know them by their sorrows. To know somebody by their pain is also then to know them by their need. Even the rich young ruler, whose pain was that he had outperformed everyone. He'd acquired great wealth in the process, and now he had a long life ahead of him. And he still felt a curious emptiness that nothing could seem to fill. What did he and what did all the others need? They needed peace. They needed rest. They needed hope. They needed forgiveness. They needed freedom from affliction. They needed deliverance. Our sorrows and failures and afflictions are sacred, not shameful, because they tell the truth about our need for redemption, our need for grace, our need for mercy, which are things extended by Jesus Christ. And these are things that only Christ alone gives perfectly. And he does for any who believe. But then what about us who have less perfect things to give? What can we give? How do we care for, like Gogh, the husband estranged from his family? How do we care for the woman who can be found at the brothel? How do we care for the person with the artistic temperament and a pattern of self-harm, like Vincent? Well, one thing we can do is we can refuse to allow their pain to be the only thing or even the main thing that we know them by. We can honor the truth that it is only the visibility of their suffering, not its presence, that sets them apart from anybody else, because we all have suffering. What can we do? We can guard their reputations and dignify their personhood. We can remember through the example of their tears that we were created to hope in a joy that is unseen. And to remind them of this as they remind us. And we can seek to know what beauty they're contributing to the world also, because everybody contributes beautiful things to this world. And we can be people who want to notice that, because hope is real. We can contend to see the beauty that people are contributing, made even more beautiful by the way it looks against the darkness all around them. And then we can join them in making beauty of our own. And at the very, very least, we can refrain from purchasing that insulting mug. Thank you. So, questions, comments, observations? And I will.
How long between the moment of the, being placed in the institution and then, I know that period of time was not a short period of time, but how long between that and when he was finally able to ultimately
It was a year and a half. So the Christmas of '88, he died in the summer of 1890. And he spent a full calendar year from May to May. So May of 1890 to May of 1889 to May of 1890 in another asylum, just north of Paris. And that's actually where Starry Night was painted. And a lot of his asylum paintings were where he lived there in Saint Remy de Provence is where that was. So he never, after this, he never thrived on his own. In fact, it was that short window of time between January, when he was in the hospital for cutting off his ear, to May. There were 4 months there where he realized, I can't live by myself, and I need to go live in a hospital where I can be cared for. And so he did. And the first painting that he painted in that asylum that he moved into, that he stayed in for a year, on the second day there, he started painting irises, which is in Los Angeles. And one of the things that I love about that painting is that the irises were originally purple. They were violet. He describes them. I've started painting these violet irises. And when you look at them now, they're blue. And it's because the red pigment that he used was new. It was called a geranium lake red. And it was very sensitive to light. And so symbolically, what I love about that is, when you associate colors with kind of emotion or meaning or message, red is a turbulent and violent color. It's the stop sign. It's passion. Blue is a peaceful. And he checked himself into this asylum and mixed these colors together of kind of this beautiful, austere, peaceful, and then this color of passion and fury and madness. And now, all these years later, it's just the blue. The red is the madness is gone, and all that remains is the piece of the painting. And I just think that's a beautiful symbol and maybe allegory for the legacy of Vincent van Gogh. But yeah, he was troubled and stayed mentally. He struggled mentally. His whole career as a painter, but these last few years in particular was pretty intense.
So it's painful to me that Van Gogh never knew the importance of his work, but there was a contribution by a Doctor Who episode.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Vincent to the present, the docent describes the impact that his work has had on the world. And it's really love to see it. Very powerful, and I would recommend to see it. Yeah. If you haven't seen this, if you type in Doctor Who Vincent van Gogh, you'll find it, and it really is staggering. I've not watched the show, but I've had people show me that clip, and so as somebody who that's all I have to go on, it's stunning. It's stunning. Yeah.
So initially at the start of this beautiful speech, you mentioned that the best way to explore art is by finding artists that resonates with you. Mm-hmm. So in what ways do you think that you yourself resonate with Vincent van Gogh? Perhaps his sufferings or his stories or his, thinkings?
I love it. Thank you. Thank you for a personal question. One of the things that I really resonate with Vincent is first of all, before I had any language for it, I just felt an emotional connection to his compositions. And I couldn't have told you why. But I think one of the deepest ways that I personally relate to Vincent van Gogh is that he was a person who was desperately trying to find beauty. He was trying to arrive at this thing that would resolve the complexities in his own heart about how he struggled in this world. And so he had this life that is sort of written down in his letters and shown to us in his work, but then he also has this inner life and this inner wrestling in his own mind. And I relate deeply to that, not to scare anybody, but I relate deeply to kind of having the and not being a contradiction, but there being an outward facing way that I navigate the world, but then an inner life that is not a contradiction of those things. It's just I don't always know how to bridge the gap between them. I would imagine that most of you relate to what I'm saying. It's a little bit like, and so that's for me with Vincent. It's the willingness to show the inner world of a pursuit of lasting beauty and healing while he himself is personally just wrestling with all of the brokenness. And so that just makes a lot of sense to me. I'm convinced that one of the things that is present in any Van Gogh painting you look at is sadness, and which, how do you measure that? Well, I'll tell you how I measured it. I got invited to speak to a class of second graders on Vincent van Gogh, and I was like, I'm going to test my theory on this. I'm not going to tell them I'm going to do it, but I'm going to test my theory. And so I was showing them Starry Night over the River Rhone, not the famous Starry Night, the one that's a little bit more, because they were studying that in class. But then I showed them a vase of his sunflowers. And I said, I'm going to put up a painting of Vincent's that is very famous, very popular. He did several of these, but it's one of the ones, and people associate these with him. And I'm going to put it up, second graders, and we're not going to say anything for 20 seconds. And at the end, I want you to tell me if you felt anything. And second graders. And so, I felt happy, I felt sunny, I felt, and then one kid went, I felt sad. And I said, did anybody else feel sad? And sure enough, there were like 3 or 4 other hands that were like, yeah, what's that about? So there's something that it's what he carries is present in his paintings. Yes, yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Van Gogh's own self-reflection, either during this time that you described or before. He had an awareness of his feelings and his emotions, obviously, that came out in his work. But in his letters, did he ever describe self-reflection on those feelings? It's not just painting it to art, but discussing it with other people, or working through those emotions in any way.
Yeah, he did a little bit. That's one of the things that's really interesting about Vincent is he wrote. Most of his correspondence is just with his brother, Theo. So most of the letters are to one person. And it's a person that he knows, knew better than anybody else and trusted implicitly. And Theo financially supported Vincent his whole life. So he would reflect. Sometimes he's not a reliable narrator, though. Like he would tell stories and frame things in certain ways. And he would have, like an example is when he sold the one painting, the Red Vineyard, when he got news that it had sold. And this was 1889, so he'd been toward the end of his life. He'd been painting for 7 years at this point, not sold anything. And when he was told how much he was paid, or how much they bought the painting for, which would have been roughly around $4,000 in our market, He said, it's not much, but a painter. I'm butchering what he said, but basically, a painter needs to make money to cover their expenses, and as though this was a common thing for him. It's like this is like you've never gotten money for your paintings, and now you're talking about it like it's just a walk, big, another day in the life of a painter. His letters, but I think also. To kind of build on your question a little bit, one of the things that we notice in reading letters by somebody like Vincent that were written, 150 years ago, many of them, or more, is that it's a reminder to us that we live in a cultural moment that processes emotion and feeling in ways now that generations before processed differently. And so even the values that we have, so it wasn't a cultural value in Vincent's day to talk about your feelings. It was in many ways it was considered self-indulgent, self-important, and unbecoming. And so people would not do that. And so when we try to, when we look at art through our 21st century eyes, we're bringing with us a lot of presuppositions and values about how to engage with a work of art, what the artist is trying to say to us through it, and what they're not trying to say to us through it. And so with artists like Vincent, or go back to like Rembrandt or people like that, there's if we try to ascertain the meaning and emotion and message of a painting in the ways that we talk about emotion and feeling and relationship and equity and all these different things, we're talking about it through a lens that is very present and very, very current, but would have been a different value set in some ways in those days. So it wouldn't have necessarily even been present. And so I wish that Vincent did a lot more of self-analysis, but self-analysis wasn't really a thing that much in those days. Even mental illness, things, basically there were kind of big bucket categories for mental illness. There was mania, there was melancholy, and there was madness. And those were the three big buckets that you would get put in. If you had epilepsy, they didn't know what epilepsy really was. They thought it was a mental illness, and so you would go to an asylum for that. People wonder if Vincent had seizures, so he had. I look at him now and I think, oh, this is a guy whose life is just full of a lot of paranoia, a lot of depression, a fair amount of narcissism probably. And we have like this vocabulary to talk about kind of emotional well-being. And in those days, they just didn't. And so, yeah, great question.
One more.
Yeah.
Do you think the same applied to Gauguin after he left Arles? Right, he was there with Van Gogh. He couldn't continue to stay there, after being attacked.
Yeah.
Or almost assaulted, right?
Yeah.
He knew he had to leave, and out of self-preservation, he did. Did he ever? Is there any stories about him, about Gauguin, and how he could not help Vincent? Right. He one, because he said it was not his goal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He was out to sell his work. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then he left. And what happened to him after?
I think there are a couple of scant mentions from Gauguin in letters about Vincent that are kind of sympathetic toward his friend. But the more I learn about Gauguin, the problematic person in a whole lot of ways, and I would be very surprised if an inclination to help Vincent in any way was ever something that he thought about. It was a transactional relationship at best for him, and he didn't do a lot from a character standpoint to win me over or to get me to write a chapter about him, except tangentially here. So I don't know. He's troubling. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your
Hi there.
talk. I had a couple of questions, but the first one was the one that you just asked, so that's good. The second question was about the quote that you showed at the very beginning, where Van Gogh says, what things I could have done
Yes.
if I did not have this disease.
Yeah.
and I saw this quote at the MFA exhibit also last year, and I was struck by it then as I was today. And I'm curious to know what your response to that sort of feeling of frustration is, and like, if you felt that yourself rather than as an outsider. So if you felt that feeling of frustration of being limited by sort of this internal struggle and feeling limited in the way that you can do things or experience life itself, would you sort of treat that as an entirely valid response, or would you kind of go the route of, well, if you didn't have to deal with, like maybe the paintings were in some way a result of those sufferings, or do you think that that's kind of making light of this?
Yeah. I think there's a, because we have all the letters, we know when he painted paintings often to the week, and we know hospital stays. And so there are places, especially in his last 4 years of being a painter, where when he would become the most mentally unstable, sometimes he would go a month or two without really painting anything. And that, I think, is what he was talking about when he was saying, oh, the things I could do if I didn't have this, because it would just stop him. However, I do think, and this is I think this is a worthwhile thing to try to unpack, is just over time. We won't unpack it all here today, but I don't think that Vincent van Gogh would be a household name had he not carried the afflictions that he carried. I think that his psyche, his emotional way of moving through the world, his loneliness, his singleness, his manic ways, his obsessive compulsive kind of tendencies at times, all those things that we have words for now are present in the work that he created in ways that wouldn't have been had those things not been there. And that's not just guessing, because we know, like, we have in these letters him talking about his own art education, his own process of learning, and he would study under people and quickly become impatient, and like, no, to the seasoned master painter, no, I don't want to paint what you're painting. That's not, it would be something that he was trying to get at, something that was just moving him and pushing him, and so yeah, it's. And I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful. One of the things Tolkien talks about artists as being border dwellers is the term that he uses. And basically, it's this idea of artists often are people who have these personalities where they live on the fringes and the extremes, and they experience great heights and great lows. And most of us don't live in those borderlands. We live kind of within the walls of the city, and we experience highs and lows, but not in the ways that some artists, musicians, poets, you just go down the list and you say, like, yeah, these people lived in ways that were really extreme and really hot to the touch. And it provides this kind of caricaturization of the human experience, which helps us see our maybe more compressed experience. And so I don't personally, I don't experience the kinds of swings that Vincent did, but I know what it's like to long for something and then have it evade me, and I know what it's like to wish that I had capacities that I don't have. And finitude is I would have to imagine in a university setting like this, that personal limits and finitude is a challenge for folks, because this is a place where you can achieve and work on the highest level with the highest work level people in areas that are changing the world right now, and yet every single one of those people involved has an attention span that only goes for so long, has the ability to comprehend how things connect only so much, and we have to, and we live within those limitations. As a writer, I wish that I had the ability to sit down and write at any time. And I I don't believe in the muse. Like I don't think that there's a, I don't wait for inspiration to strike to write. I forget who the author was who said, I only write when inspiration strikes. I just find that inspiration typically strikes between 6:30 and 9:30 in the morning, which I just love that. Because that's how, you find the times when you're like, this is when it works best for me to work. But yeah, limitations are a part of it. Yes?
And then we have one more.
Okay, great.
My question is kind of a follow-up on that. I think what little I knew about Van Gogh coming into this, I sort of associated him with like the long lineage of tortured artists who had tragic endings.
Yes,
like,
yes.
From him to Hemingway to Kurt Cobain, like this sort of idea that the greatest art comes from extreme suffering, and that suffering like never resolves itself in the life of the artist. And I'm a writer, and I have interacted with a lot of writers and artists, and I'm really interested in how that translates into the making of art, and like whether or not, I would love your take on whether or not you think suffering, like I think it's maybe a dangerous sort of idea that extreme suffering is required in order to make good art.
Yes.
But then we see so many examples of that. And I guess how do you balance the desire to make art and to make good art with the desire to live well?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So yes, I don't feel like we should go out and suffer as much as possible because that'll make our art better. So don't hear me saying that. Let me kind of come at it a bit of a different way. As a professing Christian, I will find myself in Christian environments talking about art. And so, campus ministries, churches, things like this. And people who study art and make art who are Christians will invariably ask what I think about how do I make good Christian art? Like, how do I do that? And my response is, do not try to make Christian art. Try to make art that tells the truth about the world as you experience it. And if you have a faith system, it will be present in the truth that you tell. But we can sometimes subvert the actual message of Christian faith by trying to make it Christian. Meaning, what do we mean? Inspirational, pretty, something that has a lesson at the end. That's not been my experience as a Christian. For me as a writer, even with writing about Vincent, I think that the temptation that many, I think, kind of operating in a faith-based world of writing about artists will be to try to write about artists in a way that really kind of pushes forward the admirable qualities of theirs that we should imitate, and even sometimes kind of claim certain artists about whom we don't know what their faith was, to claim them as a Christian. And I have a rule for myself, a no hagiography rule. A hagiography is a book about a saint written to show why the person was worthy of being a saint. So it's only the good stuff, and I think that whether you have great suffering or just what people might refer to as ordinary suffering, the point of it and writing about it is that it's the suffering that's common. It's not the greatness of it. It's not the unusual nature of a person's suffering that makes it relatable to other people. It's the existence of it, because in this world we suffer, and part of, for me as a Christian minister, I believe that the message of the Bible addresses suffering. Like that's kind of what the whole thing is addressing, is the brokenness that we feel and the separation that we feel from God and from other people, and the need to be redeemed and delivered of those things ultimately and eternally. And that to me, Christianity is not about like being extremely good people. It's about recognizing that we're profoundly corrupt in so many ways. And so I think that as a writer, tell the truth and focus on telling the truth about the worst of it and the truth about the best of it. And I think that's the obligation for the artist. And there's a lot of great art in the world that was written or painted or filmed by people who had very loving parents and a very stable family and a well-kept house and that kind of thing too. It's just the ones we tend to know about, more kind of are these border dwelling types. Yeah. It's a very thoughtful question. Yes.
On stewarding his brother's pain, is there much writing left from Theo Van Gogh, perhaps between he and I know the postman Ruin about Van Gogh's suffering after his death?
You might have asked the most tragic question of the day. Vincent's brother lived about a half a year longer than Vincent, and he died in an insane asylum from syphilis. And Theo and Vincent had a mercurial relationship. Every relationship Vincent had was full of he would drive people away from him, and his brother was his brother, and so he cared for Vincent, he sympathized with Vincent, and he wrote letters. It went in his writings. His correspondence with the postman and those sorts of things would be very matter of fact and very kind of businessy and about the care needs. But Theo was not. It's not as though Theo was the stable one, and Vincent was the tortured one. They both came from the same family. Their family had a history. We see now their family had a history of a lot of mental illness and not just bad parenting, but like a lot of they had there was suicide in their generations, the generation before their parents, as well. So. Yeah, it's a hard story. Now Vincent's brother's wife, Joanna, she's really the hero of the story. She's the one who preserved the letters. She's the one who preserved the paintings, and she was kind of the curator of both Theo and Vincent's estate, which made it kind of brilliant for her to be able to be the curator of the full correspondence. So she had all Vincent's letters and all Theo's letters, and so what a stroke of providence, that one person would end up kind of in custody of all of this connective tissue in his lives. All right, I see it's 3:00.
Yeah. Can we give Russ one more round of applause? Thank you, Russ.
Thank you very much.